when you talk about somebody who's in that state of mind, they don't, most of the time, kind of the science is showing about 98% of the time, they don't want to go through with it. They just want that problem, that emotion to be gone. The ones that do want to go through it are at a whole nother level. And there's a way that we can work with even that, 2% to help bring them back off that ledge. But those that are in the state where they just want the problem to end, asking them straight out, asking them bluntly, are you suicidal? They're not going to say no. If somebody is truly suicidal, they're going to answer that question as yes.
Welcome to Rebuilding the Village, a podcast that seeks to explore the causes of modern problems by examining the roots of our metaphorical village through the systems and structures in society that may have been disrupted in the technological and industrial era that we inhabit. Thank you for joining me today. Kaden Mattinson, right?
That's right.
Perfect. You're the director of the Mending Minds Village. You
That's
had quite a story, if I may say. Let's start off with how did you land in the position that you're in with what you're doing now?
So, we started out based on my daughter's own journey. We learned very early on that she was different and we didn't really know how to help. And so we went through our own fire trying to understand what was going on. And it ended up being so much more of an experience than we were prepared for. So she was diagnosed very early on. I believe the diagnosis came at 7 with a disorder called DMDD, which is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Very similar to autism, and so similar, in fact, that we've been on a wait list for, I think we're going on 3 months now to get her into official autism testing. To make sure that's not actually the diagnosis and it was just missed. But, as early as 5 and 6, I mean, we were having severe anger issues. We were having some real deep sensory issues. So certain sights, sounds, smells would just absolutely send her into a tailspin. And as a parent, that's a lot. It's a lot to understand. It's a lot to, how do you help your child with something you don't understand? And we figured there's no way that anybody else was going through these exact, scenarios. And we had an incident with her when she was about 6 years old, where, we talk about a little bit in my new book that she got very, very targeted on her brother. Nobody else. Everybody else was safe, but he was the bane of her existence. And so she did everything, and I do mean everything in her power, to remove him from her life. We had an incident where very early on, she actually attempted to take his life. And how do you process that? How do you help one child who doesn't understand the anger inside of herself and protect your other child at the same time? Not an easy task.
Yeah.
And so it just spins you.
Yeah, in that capacity, it sounds like, I guess in a very, 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 very primal sense, she was trying to protect herself and she was trying to eliminate threats, we'll say. But not recognizing that this is actually your brother, this is your family, this is not actually a person trying to kill you. But yeah, that deep, deep, deep part of your brain that tries to recognize threats, things like that, and tries to then deal with them in some capacity. Yeah.
Right.
You said it was called, what was the name of the disorder?
It's called DMDD.
DMDD. Is it genetic? Is it something, or like environmental? Has there been any kind of research around this?
So there's a lot of research around DMDD. It's a fairly new diagnosis. It's kind of, like I say, it's on that line of not quite autism, but they needed to give a diagnosis of sorts for the specific traits that were happening that weren't quite hitting that autism marker. So, the emotional dysregulation, of course, that's a big thing across the board. I mean, ADHDers, you see a lot of that. You got a lot of anxiety that you see that emotional dysregulation. And so they were like, there's traits from different diagnoses that don't quite fit into any particular line, and so their understanding of it and their research of it kind of created DMDD. This is where I get into some hot water. I've got a lot of mental health professionals that are not very happy with my take, but I'm like, if you see these kids as early as, like I say, 5 and 6 years old that are showing these signs, and by 10 you're looking at autism, why aren't we looking at autism at 5 and 6 years old?
So your take is that we should be looking for signs earlier, and people don't agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
What is the majority consensus on why earlier assessments are incorrect by their metrics versus yours?
That's been a lot of our question. That's been a lot of our a lot of our debate is, if you can do this testing at 9 and 10 and have it be effective, and the signs, the symptoms are clearly the same as they were 5 years prior, then why is there a difference? And a lot of our answer so far has been, well, it's the maturity level, it's the ability to converse with a child of that age versus a 5-year-old. And I'm like, okay, I understand that. I completely, there's no doubt that a 10-year-old can have a much more mature conversation than a 5-year-old. But a lot of what you're looking for in autism specifically isn't necessarily verbal cues. A lot of what you're seeing, especially at that 5 and 6 years old, you're seeing more sensitivities. You're seeing, late development. So late speech in some cases. You're seeing the late ability to feed themselves. And that's, of course, that's a super extreme. But there are cases like that where even that early, or even earlier. I mean, with my daughter, of course, I came into her life right about that 5-year-old mark. But we have a friend with a daughter very similar to her, and it took until she was 12 to get the autism diagnosis. But when they started talking about her past and about her developing as a child, at 18 months, they knew that she was autistic. She could be around people. She hated being around people. It was too much. She couldn't stand volume of TV or volume of radio over a certain level. It just absolutely spun her out. She could only eat one food without gagging or throwing up. Everything else they tried with her, the texture wasn't right, the taste, whatever it was, wasn't correct. And so she rejected it. And so there are signs very, very early on in a lot of autism cases. Now, they're not always that way. If you look at my daughter compared to her daughter, they have a lot of similarities, but there are definitely a lot of differences. My daughter can handle most foods. There are some that she absolutely cannot. The texture spins her out. Loud noises she cannot handle. That is pretty common across the board with autism. And so if we're looking for the extremes, if we're looking at really low functioning, no functioning autism, it's very obvious. They should be able to diagnose that very, very, very early on. But when you start talking about moderate to high functioning autism, then we need to wait until at least 5 or 6 when they can start communicating.
So I'm curious if you've heard much about this, since it's something off the top of my head. I had a friend who had a son who I believe he's autistic, and she mentioned a lot about gut inflammation with him.
Yes.
Actually, yeah, and I've seen that. I've noticed even myself that when I was younger, had a lot of social anxiety and I was shy, and for X, Y, and Z reasons. But I also had a terrible diet, horrible, and it was just like, well, it's just Cheerios and a crappy milk for breakfast, and then Sour Patch Kids for lunch, and then with a Snapple drink, and it was just sugar, sugar, sugar. And I had a really, really sensitive stomach, but along with it, like anytime I had digestive upset, I also had an extreme aversion to socializing, aversion to like being around people, couldn't think straight. Everything that was like a small perturbance in terms of like what could stimulate some kind of, feeling of anxiety was elevated 10 times more when I had that digestive upset. And I had this for 20 something plus years until I finally decided to start tweaking my diet a little bit. When I found the right diet, everything just cleared up. Like my mental state did a complete 180. And I have to imagine the same thing with people who are dealing with things like autism. Among other factors, diet plays a big part.
A big part. Absolutely. And, and when they can, her safe food is carbs, and carbs are not safe, right? We know that carbs can cause a lot of issues with gut health. And so I can see that playing a major factor.
Yeah. So with the Mending Minds Village, I was looking through your website and I came across a number of things, a little list here of stuff. You really went through some personal hell, it looks like, at some point in your life, losing a lot of people in the span of 6 months.
Yes.
And I figured this was kind of like the origin story of where this all started from. So if you're interested, if we were able to talk about that and how that progressed into what it is today.
Yeah, so that one is a little bit separate. That is a part of my own mental health journey, but it's interesting how we take all of our directors and we sat us all down in a board meeting, and we said, if we're going to do this, if we're really going to take this off, then we need to be upfront with each other. We need to be vulnerable with each other and talk about our own journeys, because that's really how we're going to help other people is by having a certain level of understanding. And so for it was 2013. We lost 21. Yeah, I lost 21 people in about 6 months. And a huge part of the reason we got into suicide prevention is because about 60% of those were suicides. And
so a little over 10 people.
Yeah. So we had, I want to say we had 11 of those were suicides. And so that, we talked about that, about how we all had lost a significant amount of people to suicide, and how that affects not only our mental health, but then the impact that has on your kids if you're not dealing with it, on your work, on every aspect of your life. You experience that level of trauma and then just ignore it, and it is what it is, and not expect that would create some turmoil in your life. And we've all had our own levels of of suicidal ideation ourselves, and a lot of that comes from, of course, all of those losses of we've all seen it, we've all been there. And so we sat down and we talked about a lot of those stories, and about kind of some of the key points that we saw throughout each story. And we decided that we would get myself and my Southern Utah director, Tracy, certified in QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer. So that, number one, we can help understand our own journey. But number two, we can help in these families that we're seeing the warning signs in. We can step in with these clients and say, hey, look, really, really honestly, are you okay? Are you suicidal at all? Are you, depressed and heading down that road? Because when you start talking about cases like Aspen's, it gets isolating. There is nobody who understands it. And the very few people that do understand it don't want to talk about it because it pushes people out or pushes people away. And so when you have severe mental health cases like that going on in a home, those families begin to start really digressing. And so we put together the QPR, we put together our outreach programs, and it's been an amazing 4 years. We're working into our 5th year, and it's been amazing to watch the transformation.
So I found the QPR was developed by Dr. Paul Quinnett, 1955. Yes. And the idea being that you don't push somebody in that direction, you have to kind of persuade them, because people just naturally, even if you're not suicidal necessarily, are easy about being told what to do. And especially if you're really in that kind of state of mind. So the question persuade, it's more like an inquisiting, trying to pondering, asking them, and then kind of suggesting in that direction, like there might be something we can do to help you if you're interested, and then trying to refer them in that direction.
Yeah, and the conversation around it, when you start talking about persuading, when you talk about somebody who's in that state of mind, they don't most of the time, kind of the science is showing about 98% of the time, they don't want to go through with it. They just want that problem, that emotion to be gone. The ones that do want to go through it are at a whole nother level. And there's a way that we can work with even that, 2% to help bring them back off that ledge. But those that are in the state where they just want the problem to end, asking them straight out, asking them bluntly, are you suicidal? They're not going to say no. If somebody is truly suicidal, they're going to answer that question as yes. And it's about being blunt. I mean, it's about being human to human conversation. I'm genuinely concerned about you. You can't go into it like a therapist. Obviously, you got to go into it as a friend, as an ally. And once you've asked that question, it's been answered yes. Then we start working into how do we get you resources? How do we help connect you with somebody that can help walk you back away from that ledge? And that conversation happens pretty quickly. We've had it since we've been trained. We've had that conversation twice, and it goes very, very quickly once you get that yes.
Yeah, there's my experience. Men are reluctant to ask for help because they have this feeling of like, I'm going to be pitied. I'm going to be seen as weak. I'm going to be seen. I should be able to do this on my own. I should be able to just like power through this. Why can't I? There must be something wrong with me. I'm not a good enough of a man. Therefore, X, Y, and Z, A, B, C.
All
and then it goes down that road.
the things, right?
Yeah.
And we see, you nailed it right on the head. I mean, men are 90% more likely to go through with a suicide because of that lack of emotional assistance. Men are seen as we're supposed to be this head, this leader, this director. So there's no way that we could have our own mental health issues going on. I mean, that's just not true. It's not. There are people that are more than willing to help out with both men and women. Men are more matter of fact. They're also quicker to come to the conclusion and move forward with it. And then then we see that men are also, it was 90% as of 2023, 90% more likely to go with a firearm as their method of choice because it is a final. It is an absolute. And so, when we talk about that conversation, I try to keep politics out of everything, but it's brought a whole new light to me for the conversation around guns and gun safety and all that kind of thing. And just to throw briefly out there, I'm not saying get rid of guns. I am a proud gun owner. That's not the conversation at all. It's how do we take the firearms out of the equation when we reach that level? How do we have a friend intervene? How do we shape that conversation so that the man in that question feels they're being supported? Absolutely. And then also that we're keeping them from that end answer. And so that's something that we've been trying to tackle with our organization, is where we're working with families. We don't just cover the children. Yes, we're a youth organization, but the youth have to be supported somewhere. They have to be taken care of by a family member, whether it's the parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, foster care, whatever the situation. We want to make sure that that whole family unit is taken care of. And so we ask everybody. We involve everybody in the process. And so we have talked about even possibly setting up like a community safe, where if you feel like you are in that place where you feel like you cannot guarantee me that you'll be here in the morning, then we lock up the weapons, we lock up any other sharp objects, medications, anything out there that could be a tool that could be used. We put it in a safe for you voluntarily. This is not a forced thing. It's something that we take it out of the equation. We sign in a document that says, this is all your stuff. At any time you call me, you want it back, you come and get it. We meet you, you come and pick it up. But the caveat to that is you need to have somebody vet for you. You need to have a spouse, a child, a mental health therapist, whoever it is that is helping you in that moment. Let us know they are, they're outside of this window. They're not feeling that way any longer. And it is safe to collect these items.
There's a good book that is called I Don't Want to Talk About It. I referred to it a couple times in this podcast, and it's specifically about men's depression.
Yeah.
and how there's two types of depression. Generally, there's overt and covert.
And covert. Yep.
Yeah, meaning like they're actually showing it on their shoulder or they're hiding it really, really, really well. And with the vetting process, do you go through multiple people, or is it generally like one or two assigned people? Because it's, I wonder to what degree some people can really hide it like better than you. Like they're really good actors, they're really good pretenders, and really deep down there's like that disgusting amount of pain in there. And even then, is there methods to kind of intentionally almost like poke that wound to see if it's still there?
Yeah, so there's what we're finding is that honestly, there is always somebody who knows you better than you know yourself. Always. Sometimes it's a spouse, but sometimes it's one of your children. And my daughter's really good about finding those wounds when she needs to. And so we ask when we're talking, is there somebody who gets you? Is there somebody who just gets under your skin every chance they get because they have that relationship? And and a lot of times they'll come back and say, yeah, my wife knows me better than anybody, or my kid knows me better than myself, or my neighbor or best friend or whoever it is. And we say, great, let's get them on the phone. Let's talk to them. They need to be your corner right now. They need to be that coach in the corner walking us through the next steps. That kind of shows two things. One, it proves that misbelief in your own mind that nobody cares anymore, because you have somebody who's going, I've been over here the whole time. You get into that mindset, start pushing people away, and kind of create that distance in yourself. And so when somebody shows up and is strong and, no, I'm not going anywhere. We're gonna get through this, it kind of shoots that misbelief down, and then that's what kind of sets the rocky stage to fix that thinking. Is we gotta first, you can't knock a boxer out immediately. You gotta rock them, and then you gotta knock them. And so it's the same in that ideation, where we've gotta rock it. We've got to tip that thinking out a little bit, and then we bring somebody in that can totally put it to bed.
Now, do you notice in these families, because you mentioned 11 people in 6 months, the first thing that pops into my mind is like a rough outline of a sequence of events leading up to that. Could be home related, could be environmental, maybe someone lost their job, downturn in the economy. I know COVID was a big one, where I think the rate of self-inflicted like suicides, whatever, was pretty dramatic because everybody was stuck at home. And if there was any problems that weren't dealt with, then you were just stuck in a room with them 24 hours a day for 6 to 8 months. And it happened. But I mentioned in this case, there is some approximate environmental circumstances that is exaggerating an underlying issue that leads to this.
Yeah, and so that's part of the conversation that we have is, what's been going on in your life, even in the last 90 days. What happened in your childhood that you haven't been able to process or deal with? What's happened in your relationship? How's work life? Is there anything in particular? And sometimes you hear a lot of, no, there's nothing. Like, it's just me. It's just my thinking. And that can be true. But then we start looking at what, medications. Is there a medication influence? There are some meds that mess with the chemical balance in the brain. And so it can sway the depression from one side to the other. We start looking at how's your eating habits, how's your sleep been. If you're not sleeping, or if you're getting 8 and 12 hours a week of sleep, the brain, then the chemicals are off balanced, and you start kind of doing some weird thinking. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And so for us, as an instructor, we know that there's a lot. We know that there's a lot that can be complex, that can play into it. And so we ask, just so we know kind of what direction we need to start sending that person to. So do we need to contact a psychologist? Is a therapist okay? Is there a combination? Do we need to be looking at inpatient? Or, do we need to do 72 hours so that we can kind of get an overall take on this person? And as a QPR instructor, I don't want to go through the journey of being a therapist. I love working as an advocate. I love working as a peer support specialist. working with families to find that balance. I don't think I would do well as a therapist. I get to kind of see the beginning stages and see the change, but not deal with that, the certain level of trauma that a trained therapist goes through. And so because of that, I'm not trained to look for all those things. I'm not trained to look for all those markers. What I know is I ask certain questions, like I said, about how's home life, how's eating, how's sleeping, how's all those things, so that we can go, okay, is this life or death? Is this an emergent trauma that we need to get handled immediately? Or is this something that we get in touch with a therapist and you're going to be okay? We can walk you through the steps to get through a week until you can get into a therapist. And then that's really the extent of our therapy on that. Then we get into more case management. Then we start working with the family and go, okay, I know you're worried about money in the home. So do you need help with rent? Do you need help with food? Do you need help with, what kind of basic living things, utilities coming up, phone bills, anything like that? Because if that's the case, we have resources we can connect you with. We can help with certain things. And then we make those conversations, we make those connections, and again, take some of that weight off. Because of course, especially when you're talking with the male population, that's our biggest concern. If I'm out getting, who's taking care of the family? And so we say, we will do that. We will play that role for the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days. I don't care, until we can get you stable.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in the short term, that's more the shorter term notice when you mentioned like the past 30 days, past 90 days, what's your sleep like lately? What's your sleep? But I wonder if there's trends we could see further back. Like
I'm sure.
Generationally, which there is, and then looking for like what's happening on those generational levels. Because even the name of the podcast, like Rebuilding the Village, my perception of like the village essentially is like this giant machine of sorts that is designed to essentially guide people through the stages of development in life, with certain people there along the way that kind of helps you like walk up the ladder gradually and put you to where you're going to then help maintaining this machine in some capacity. And then has to be some degree of a malfunction somewhere in there. That's because if it's one thing, if you said, we had a couple people take their lives, it's really unfortunate. But when it starts to become a massive trend across time where it's been increasing rapidly across the past 20, 30 years, even the mental health thing we mentioned before with younger kids, that there's something wrong with the machine, there's something wrong with the system, and then we're trying to diagnose where it's coming from and what's happening with it. And in the case of like the men's just to start with, like for the men's issues, like this lack of purpose, I wonder to what degree, if there's a strong correlation to like economic downturns and increase in mortality through suicide and things like that, if there's specific things even in the modern day trend with like this I would almost say some level of like an attack on masculinity and trying to figure out what it should become, what it is nowadays, that may be throwing guys for a tailspin, because a lot of them were just like, well, my grandfather told me to be a big tough man holding my feelings, and he seemed okay. So why don't I do the same thing? And it's just like, well, we don't really need you to do that anymore. But then again, what do we like define it as, so that you can still find a sense of purpose within your life and your family, but also in the broader community, and not be afraid to also lean on other people and recognize that like we're all in this together, and we're all in this one big village together.
Right. Yeah. And again, that conversation, it's interesting to see how things trended and then what was happening around that time. So like you say, COVID was a big one. We had massive trauma. We had, everybody was isolated, right? And so people that needed that social interaction to keep them going, people that needed that outside help, lost it. And so they're home dealing with their own wheels turning. Then you have parents at home who can't help sustain their families. And so that's, of course, a big factor. If you feel like you've lost the ability to be stable, then you see a lot of those wheels turning. But then you talk about family history. And that's one of the big key questions that we ask. How many people have you lost? And what kind of relationship do you have with them? We watch some people super closely that are starting to struggle, especially ones that we have conversations where dad killed himself. Then you have grandpa who did the same, and you have uncle who did the same. And, you start to see the trends. Then you start to be concerned about the individual. And we really start to heavily push for getting into treatment and making sure that you're taking care of yourself. But then on the other side of that, you see some that come on very, very quickly, that they don't have any genetic history. There's no predisposition. It's really sometimes spins somebody out, and that ends up being, like I said, other factors. There ends up being some kind of medication imbalance. Ends up being some kind of food intake that was off. There ends up being, some factor at work where they lost the job they'd been working for 20 years. And so it throws that kind of instability off. And there's been a lot of conversation about if something like that happens and it is traumatic enough to that individual, then the wheels start to turn and they start to really down spiral. And especially the ones that you talked about that are really good about hiding things, those are the ones that you see the struggles with. One incident like that just sits and eats at them and eats at them and eats at them. So that's why we say it's so important that you have people in your corner, you have friends, family members, best friend who knows you better than you know yourself, so that they come to us with this training and say, hey, I've got this friend that she's just not doing very well. I know she lost her job and now everything in her world has turned upside down. And we make that intervention.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like the importance of like men's groups in particular for men dealing with this kind of stuff. And it's this idea of how like there is something of voluntary exposure to these feelings that has to take place among other people to kind of show you. And that is one thing. And the other thing, to what degree, and maybe this is a newer thing that people are really kind of getting their heads around, but to what degree people need to be aware of what the term is, like metacognition, realizing that like the thoughts you're having are not really your thoughts. They're like, you're not the one having this loop go on. It's another part of your brain. It's telling another part of your brain to start ruminating on this and thinking about this. And it feels so rational and logical because you think you're having a thought, when in reality, there's just some unresolved loop somewhere in there that you haven't been really able to grasp onto, understand that like, if you're feeling this way, it's not because you're a bad person or this or that. There's just something else going on in your head that's you're not in control of. It's influencing your thinking, and having people around that can look at it and from an exposure point, just like see it and make you realize. It's like one thing to say, like, I know I'll feel better if I talk to somebody. And then when you actually talk to somebody and you're like, whoa, this just feels way more intense than I thought. You can't feel it till you feel it. You can't experience it until you experience it.
Right. Yeah. And that's where we talk about, that past trauma, past traumas. You would be amazed at the amount of people that don't deal with it, that don't go into therapy, that don't talk to anybody. And so, that loop just goes and goes and goes and goes. And that can raise havoc in your life. And so everybody, we're talking everybody can use some treatment. Everybody's had trauma in their life. And so if we want to stop the cycles and we want to stop the stigma, it needs to be an open conversation.
There's a good quote. It was Bessel van der Kolk. It was the body keeps a score. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
And it's something like intergenerational trauma is like a wildfire that keeps ripping through generation to generation until somebody decides to stand in front of it and stop it.
And put it out.
Yeah. And in that capacity, it's like it is like an open. And I think that the term trauma, I think, is getting to this point where it's like you say it so many times and it starts to lose meaning in your head. But I think a lot of people are hearing that because most people associate the word trauma as like you got hit in the face with a baseball bat, you got into a car crash. It's like it's something like you were on top of a grenade when it off. That's trauma. But your mother didn't love you enough, your dad didn't care, didn't say he loved you and give enough hugs. That's trauma. Yeah, kind of is.
Yeah, kind of is.
Yeah,
because it sets the tone in your own personal child, development, because that sets the tone for how you're going to raise your children.
And in this case of like this has become interesting to me that in the last I think it's the idea, most of what I hear people say is like this all kind of started around the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, around when
Yep.
factories kicked in, mainly because we were mostly an agrarian economy, mostly globally. Like 90% of people worked on farms, but you worked in proximity to your family and your kids every
And
single
every
day.
day. Yeah.
And now it's like, oh, mom and dad are going to the factory 2 miles away to 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day. They don't see you. That's completely foreign to our evolutionary pathway. Like we are really designed to be extremely social creatures for a variety of reasons. And we're throwing a massive wrench into that system. And now it's starting to cause this massive ripple effect and us trying to adapt to it and see where these problems start to arise while we're trying to chase like continued increasing technological growth in different directions, but not realizing how much it starts to have this impact, not only on you, but also on your family and people around you.
Yeah. Well, and you know, and it's like I say, a lot of people laugh when I say this, but the Latino communities have it absolutely right. You know, you have a lot of our Native American communities that have it absolutely right. They stay together as a family unit. They, grandma, mom, dad, now grandkids, all live in the same home, and they stay that way. And if they're not in the same home, they're buying homes right next to each other so that they're at least in the same proximity. And the amount of relationship building that that's doing for those families is amazing. And, you know, and then you look at predominantly white communities, and we can't wait to get out of mom and dad's home. Let me go. Let me be free. And that's, I mean, generational. We've been doing that for 100 years. The communities around where those families are now sometimes 1,500 miles apart, those relationships are not as strong as our minority communities are. And that's been something I've brought that up multiple times where I'm like, okay, you know, this is how everything was in the 1800s when, you know, when the pioneers settled in all over Utah and all over the United States. Those families were 20, 30 strong, and they were working together. They were farming the property. They were taking care of the house. Whoever the maternal figure was in the home, whether it was grandma or mom, aunt sometimes was taking care of the home, taking care of the kids. And then the men would get up, the kids would go out and help. You'd come back for lunch, mom would be home making lunch, you know, and then you go back out in the field and you're all working together. But that was it, is you were working together. And so that bond, I mean, of course, there's issues in every family. There's going to be, there's tension, but they know way better how to communicate those problems and how to work through them. And that creates such a more intense family bond, you know? And so you wonder why so many like one of the best things I've ever seen in working with a family was we had an aunt and uncle with their new baby was living in a home with grandma, with mom and dad. Man, it was such a huge house. And there was probably, I don't know, 15 to 20 people in the home. And they were working on putting together quinceanera for one of the girls. And the whole family was working on it. And so we walked in and it was a party. Like it was a pre-party for the party. And it was insane. It was amazing. And I was like, I told him, I said, you would never see our home putting this together. Like once grandma's passed on, the family doesn't get together anymore. And in the Latino community, mom takes over grandma's role and everything continues. And it keeps moving, and they follow in that family tradition. And I'm like, imagine the conversation that could be had. Imagine the peace that would come over this country if, instead of judging our neighbors and judging other religions and other minorities, what if we learn? What if we take a piece of that information and put it to our own use and see how much of the conversation changes?
I do massage therapy, and I had a girl come in one day, she's in her early 20s, and she mentioned how I think her grandfather was the one that essentially had like the family dinners on Sunday. She's Italian,
Yeah.
Italian Sunday dinner. And when he passed away, they just kind of was like, yeah, but it's a lot of work, and like there's one of cooking and prep time and all that stuff. We kind of stopped doing it. We do like once a month maybe. And I was talking like, you have no idea, like, yeah, it's a hard work, it's a lot of work. You have no idea the return on value you're getting by just like being there around each other and just spending time together. That is what it's doing for your brain in ways you can't see, and it's hard to really quantify. that in the long term, we might say, like, why did this person get so depressed? Well, must because of work, must because this, must that, like, because they haven't had that weekly socialization they used to have. They haven't been
Right.
around people as much as they used to. And it's very
Right.
difficult to pinpoint an exact moment in time where it all started. But losing values and traditions and customs like that, where people will just, like every Sunday, no matter what, we're all going to meet up once a
That's
week. We got
right.
any problems, we're going to just flesh it out then and there. We're going to say we love each other and just move on, and this and that. And yeah, I know you mentioned with like Latino families. I noticed it also with a lot of like Middle Eastern families,
Middle
Jewish
Eastern.
families,
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah, even in the news nowadays, you'll see a lot of things in the news saying like kids don't want to move out anymore. They don't want to. We were all just desperate to get out of our houses, and then realizing like, well, there probably was a value to being
Probably
stuck
was a
on that. We're now seeing like why are kids. So there's a multitude of reasons as to why younger kids are getting massively anxious and depressed nowadays. Social media notwithstanding, for a big one of those.
Oh yeah,
But
absolutely.
the big portion of it being like, are we changing? And then things are now breaking in ways that we don't understand, and trying to look for, like, putting somebody on medication is just like a band-aid to a bigger like gushing wound, which is like, I don't spend enough time with my family if I'm
Yeah.
depressed, or I don't spend enough time with people now because I'm like the workaholics, being like trying to chase a sense of status and value in their work life rather than building a community at home and trying to add value to that, like being a bigger piece of the pie. There's a good book, Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Righteous Mind. I really enjoyed
Yes.
it. And yeah, he talks about like how we're one part monkey and one part like honeybee, and that we have the individual part of us that wants to do our own thing, but also another part of us that wants to be part of a community that operates
Right.
well within a community. And if you don't get that opportunity to do that, your ego and things and your sense of individualism will just skyrocket out of control, but at the cost of other parts of your health and wellness.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and not to say that there's not, some value in medication. I mean, when we talk about the chemical imbalance and things like that, sure, there's a place for some of this medication. But I think we're overly medicated. I think use the medication when it's necessary, but also what are we doing to replace the medication? What are we doing to work somebody off of that? And, you know, reconnecting those relationships. I mean, that is our biggest push when I'm working with any family, and, any kid, especially young kid, up to teenage years. They need the relationships. They don't need medications as much. They need that connection, the support. And so that's kind of where the seeing framework came from, is like, how can we quantify this? How can we simplify the process and give them something to work toward? And so we came up with, really, there's 4 points that any individual, whether it's adult or child, needs to work through their mental health. And number one, first and foremost, is going to be support. They've got to have that support system. And not far behind that is inclusivity. If they're isolated and not included in the process, we're talking about them. We're not talking with them. And I don't know anybody who enjoys being talked about. And so we've got to include them in the process. But then beyond that, even bigger picture is, we bring back that family. We bring back that connection. And so, who do you feel safe around? Who do you want included in your journey? And then when we talk about nurturing is that end part. And people get so funny around that one, because it's like, well, I'm not a child. I don't need nurturing.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry to cut in, but there's a line somewhere in the book of the I don't want to talk about a book. I remember reading it, and he's talking about these stories of men in men's group. They're dealing with a lot of stress and struggles, and just stories of how these guys and had to work with each other. And they're basically, the guy who wrote the book is a therapist, and he's trying to encourage these guys to like let these guys help you. And there was some line where I remember I was driving, I was listening to the audiobook, and I heard him say, like, he said something like he was kind of telling like what happened in one of these groups. And he
Right,
said
right.
something like the guy was crying, or he wanted to cry because he had some shame around something, and he just felt weird. And the therapist was like, let these men nurture you. And even I was like, oh God, that just sounds so off. I don't know what about it. What the hell is, like, let these men help you, let them support you, let them nurture you. Something about the word. caught me off, and I was like, "Oh, that's not good." Feeling that
Right.
way, but it's essential. But there is something maternal, feminine, motherly about nurture. But there is
Right.
something within, like, men can help other men by the, like, nurturing effect to it that a lot of guys are very opposed to exploring that feeling of
Yeah.
letting other people, and even people, and that may not necessarily be guys. It could be just like people who are tough, people who are very have a thick exterior, and they don't want to. They're protecting this scared part of themselves, and it's just like, I don't want to be nurtured. Like, I'm not a baby. It's just like, no,
Yeah.
but it's still value in there.
It's still a value. And it is, and we look at it as, yes, the word nurture is in there because that's what it is. I mean, that's by definition, that's what it is. But we, especially as men, especially as, as you say, more masculine, more, more tough exterior kind of people, we don't look at it as nurturing. We look at it as supporting. We look at it as building. There's any number of other terms that can be used. But what it all boils down to is that it is nurturing. As a dad, as a father, as that paternal figure, you're going to nurture your children just in a different way. You're going to be the heat, that fire to build that growth, to grow that diamond, right? And so it's a huge part of it. And when you take all three of those together, you take the support, the inclusivity of the nurturing together, you're gonna create growth. You're gonna create the fire that creates growth. And that one is such a funny one because people get so on growth has to look like this perfect little package and it has to be exactly fit in these things to grow. And it's like, no. See, a month ago, you weren't able to tell me that you were mad because you didn't get the dinner that you wanted. But really, what you're telling me is that you didn't feel heard. And now here we are a month later, and it's not about the food. It's not about the transportation. It's not about any of these over catches. It's all about the underlying, you actually can tell me that I'm not feeling heard at this point. And it changes the whole conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is growth. The fact that you're able to like go from exploding over the milk being gone to now able to have a game plan and have a way to fix that. That is growth. Growth is not this huge massive thing. It's the little steps in between that makes the difference.
I went down for a trip to Georgia recently to visit some friends, and I've had this issue myself for a while. And this was like, it was a very transformative weekend in this little micro moment I had thinking
Yeah.
about this. And I was sitting in the airport, and I had like a 2-hour delay for my flight, so I was just sitting there reading a book, and I'm just watching like every little tiny thing going on between the staff and the place, and then like you see the food courts, thinking about like, how did the food get there, what kind of food do they serve, why they decided to do that, and what the process is of how they board people on the plane and how the plane lines up and everything, and then looking at the plane, the runway, the complexity of the whole place, and then the transportation is going to get there, how they could take like an air train to get to the planes to the airport. And like, initially the first thought that runs across your mind is, holy crap, this is complex, I could never do this, I can never think
Right.
this up. And then after a while, I started to think like, how many times did they screw up before they figured this out? How many times did they make a mistake before they got this to where it is right now? And they're
Yeah.
still iterating on it. And I think, like when you mentioned with growth, people have this perception of like, it has to be a step 1 through 10, and I know exactly what to do, or else it's not going to work properly. Versus saying to yourself, like, growth is going to include a lot of failure. It's going to be a lot of mistakes and bumps along the way. Learning to enjoy the process of trying and making mistakes and learning from your mistakes is way better than saying, I'm not going to do anything until I know exactly what to do, because then you're never going to do anything.
Right. Right. And it's all about the journey to get there. It's
Yep.
all about, we celebrate. Took me a long time to get here. Okay, so this is not something I'm telling other people to jump right into now. But we celebrate failures in this house.
Mm-hmm.
We celebrate mistakes. Why? Because it's an opportunity for you to learn something new. Everybody hears that, and the reactions that we get from that is so funny, because people are like, what do you mean you celebrate mistakes? Like that's weird. That's weird. And I'm like, but is it though? Because I can tell you for a fact that I'm happy to admit when I mess something up. because it's a learning opportunity. I get to learn something new today. And if we could change that mentality of I messed up, therefore I suck, therefore I'm a failure, therefore, and change that to, well, obviously I didn't know what I thought I did. So now I'm going to figure out what I thought I knew. I'm going to learn it so that I know for I know for tomorrow how to do that.
I've had moments I've seen with friends where we're playing a video game together and they're better at me, something like that, or any kind of activity. And like, they'll be telling me like, oh, what you should do is X, Y, Z, ABC. I could literally feel my heart start to race. My blood pressure spikes. And my body's just like, tell him to screw off, tell him to screw off. I'm like, another part of me is like, no. You don't know what you're doing. They do know. Shut up and listen. And I have to sit there and actively fight the urge to shut down while they're telling me these things. Because I know they're trying to help me. They know something I don't. I have this is a learning opportunity. But it's gotten better with time. When I was younger, like, oh my God, I could not stand being told what to do. But it's like this again, this person knows something you don't. This is an opportunity. And just training yourself to say you're not under attack because someone's trying to help you. You're not under attack because so this is something new you haven't done before. Even with this podcast, like I said, I'm up with like episode, I don't know, 12 or 15. The first 3 episodes, in my opinion, were a complete disaster. And they had to be in order for me to be where I am now. And
That's
like,
right.
even then, it's getting better. The more I learn, the more I do. I'm getting better at taking notes, better at asking questions, better holding conversations. My voice, the first few episodes, my voice was just totally flat the entire time. And now I'm like, okay, I need to do a little bit more up and downs, a little bit more exciting, a little more inflections. Actually, because if people are listening to audio, they're gonna think I'm a freaking robot. So like, okay, that was embarrassing, but now I know, okay, more inflection, more enthusiasm, more emotion. Don't be afraid to just express and things like that, and then just keep iterating on those little mistakes along the way. And it's like you said, celebrating mistakes. There's a book I'm reading right now. It's really funny that there was a Carl Jung quote, and he said something like, it's like when someone came to him and said, "Hey, I just got a promotion at work." His response was like, "I'm so sorry to hear that, but if we all stick together, we'll get through this." And then if they said, and then it would the opposite would say, "I just lost my job," and it was like, "Great, let's pop a bottle of wine and celebrate."
Congratulations.
Congrats, because it's like an opportunity to say like, this is going to suck and you're going to grow from this pain or from this learning opportunity or from what it is. Like, this is where like you're not, like, your successes will take care of themselves. But the failures are what you have to really like brace yourself and learn to not be afraid to have like a bit of like a tempering or a carving off of the parts of you that are no longer functioning anymore. It's painful to let go of that, but that's the process of letting yourself grow and improve, is by letting go of dead weight and bad ideas and things like that were holding you back. So celebrating failure, I love that idea. Yeah.
Thomas Edison took 99 times to make the light bulb before he got it on the 100th try. And people think about that. Like we talk about that with the kids that we work with, because they get so mad that after 3 or 4 tries, they're still not understanding. And we're like, therapy, when you're talking about learning emotions, when you're talking about learning such major complex things, you're not going to get it on day 3. You're just not. You're going to be better than you were yesterday for sure, but you're not going to have it down. And so when you talk about something like the light bulb, something that they can comprehend and look at, and we're like, it took them 100 tries to get that right. 100 tries. And the light bulb that we have today has been changed 1,000 times since that first one was invented. Something that simple, but you can understand that, okay, well, if somebody can, if he can do it 100 times, I can do it 100 times. It takes 21 days to make or break a habit. 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to get it right on day 3.
I think they said it was like 1,000 tries, something like that, if you include every little thing. But what they said was they interviewed him. Said it was a reporter that interviewed him and said, "How did it feel to like take 1,000 tries to get it right?" And he said, "I didn't fail 1,000 times. I learned 999 ways how not to make a light bulb."
Exactly.
And so, yeah, even in my own life, I play piano, and I've been playing on and off for about 5 to 7 years now. And there were some songs that I wanted to learn that I had to literally go back down to just like absolute baby steps. And it was like no one was around but me. It was just me. But it was still like that feeling of humiliation, embarrassment. Like, to who? Like, nobody can see me playing right now. It's just literally just me. And just trying baby step. Like I'm working through like, oh my God, I'm terrible. This is so embarrassing. I suck. I'm never going to learn this. And then like 2-3 years later, practicing these songs and being able to play them masterfully and looking back and thinking like, I was like really attacking myself. And now look what I did. Holy crap. This is amazing. But what's interesting about that, and I learned from one of the other podcasts I did with another, who was a social worker, was talking about there's a big part, there's all different systems in your brain as to why you're going through that feeling of fear and anxiety and whatnot, and the frustration around failure. But there was the amygdala was a big part of it. And it's like the fear center of your brain, and how the only way it learns is through experience. You cannot talk yourself into not being afraid or frustrated, or not. You have to experience it and then just practice calming down in that experience. And then just getting, this is with me and like the podcast, is like I've experienced 12-15 episodes before and a lot of little mistakes along the way. The battery of my camera died several times in the beginning. I had to figure that one out. I had to like get a whole setup on the methodology and all this stuff, figuring out the editing software. The microphone for the first few episodes was terrible. And yeah, it was embarrassing, but it's just like, well, now I know, and that experience I can learn from. But the biggest benefit within all of that was just this feeling of, I'm not going to die from making a mistake. And I know from experience, I'm not going to die from making a mistake because I've experienced it. And this is a big one I think you see with a lot of kids nowadays, especially nowadays with almost like newer parenting, or modern, like new age parenting, is like this fear of letting your kids run and scrape their knees.
Yeah.
And how it leads to things like anxiety and depression and things like that, because they don't have enough of a sense of self-confidence through those little micro mistakes to know that they're not going to have, which may then graduate into adulthood and they still have it, carries over into their family life, and then also into their community. And then you wonder why people are having mental health issues, among other things as to why it is. But a lot of it, that interconnection of just practice failure, like fail gracefully, fail confidently.
Right. Yeah. And you know, and it's funny you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I've talked about recently this week on a podcast, was how, you know, we're starting to have conversations with the adult population. We're starting to talk to the homeless population. We're starting to talk to the addiction population and find out, really boiling it down, where those issues come from. And a lot of them have memories from 5, 6, 7 years old that eventually are ignored and compound until we reach 18, have no idea how to handle life, have no idea how to process emotion or how to understand emotion, let alone process it. And then can't hold a job, and you know, and then the snowball just rolls. And so it's like it is so important for us to start this conversation as early as possible, as early as a child understands it. How much of that problem can we eliminate by simply having these conversations?
Yeah, I have a small story regarding my dad. And by the way, Dad, if you ever watched this episode, I love you. Don't worry. I remember talking to him, and we were talking about raising kids. And he lost his father when he was very young, and it makes me place a part into it. But we're talking about raising kids, and he mentioned how like with raising kids, you're kind of just figuring out as you go. And I remember hearing that, and first thought was like, how the hell did we survive as a species if we had to just figure it out as we go every time? There had to be some amount of intergenerational wisdom that was passed along that's like compounding. Like when you're born today, if you're learning about, you know, math and science, that was generations of people that figured it out before you, who are then now passing the torch off to you to try to continue pushing as far as we can. But in the last 50, 100 something years, like this, like we said, people not being in family units and socializing with, you know, spending time with their family and friends or communities and things like that, you're losing these little like micro interactions and opportunities to learn little things among people around you. And that intergenerational wisdom is kind of getting like shut out in places where, like we said before, that people aren't like get out of the house as soon as you can. As soon as you hit 18, run out the door. Versus other communities where it's like, no, we stay until like we literally can't. And if we can't, we go next door. So we stay within proximity, because there's so much knowledge and value you can't find on Google. You can't find in a textbook, or like there's like how to raise a kid in this one particular situation. How do I do that? Talk to grandma. She's done this 5, 6, 7 times. Talk to grandpa. Talk to the uncle down the street. Talk to the neighbor who's been there. They know things that you can't just throw into it. Like we've had I'm sure that more than our fair share of like parenting gurus and family experts come in the last, 50, 60, 70 years, when in reality is like we had it pretty much down to a science, the way things were going for a long time in these community aspects that we're now just dissolving and wondering why things are falling apart.
That's right.
Yeah.
Pretty wild conversation.
So just to reiterate, the SING framework is support.
Yep. Inclusivity.
Support, inclusivity, nurturing, and then growth. On your website, also, I wanted to touch on, what is Aspen's Army?
So Aspen actually created that herself. Aspen is my daughter that we've been dealing with her mental health struggles. And so she was really the beginning of Mending Minds Village. She was going through it and made a comment to us one day that there are so many kids like her who need help. And we were like, that's an interesting conversation. Okay, let's have that. And so we talked to some of the other families that we had run into and realized that there is a huge community of kids that needs help, not just with DMDD, but all kinds of, mental challenges. And so we started working the organization, and just a couple of years ago, she comes to us and she was like, she'd made a comment very similar to, all these people have come together and it's kind of like we've formed an army. And we were like, hold on, you might be onto something there. that might actually make sense. And so we asked her to kind of explain it in her own terms. And she said, we've got this huge group of people who jumps in and fights battles every day. We battle the system, we battle the state, we battle everybody. And look at what we're doing and look at how much change we're making. And I was like, that's a good point. I said, so what should we call your group? Like, and she's like, well, it's Mending Minds Village, duh. And I was like, no. But you started this, you want some kind of connection. So what should we call it? And she's went off for an hour. I mean, that was cut off the conversation there, walked away for an hour. Came back and we had forgotten about it at this point. And she comes back in and goes, it's Aspen's Army. I'm like, took a minute. I had to think about it. And I was like, what do you mean it's Aspen's Army? And she's like, remember you said, what should we call my group? It's Aspen's Army. And I was like, done, coined. Like we'll run with that. And so volunteers that come in to work with this are now part of Aspen's Army. Her therapist knows that she is part of Aspen's Army. And it's all under Mending Minds Village. It's all still the same organization, but it is her way of making a difference, and it's her way of contributing to the organization.
It's beautiful. I love that. So let's start. You mentioned you're writing a book.
So we put all the information together from everything that we've done, from the SING framework to the research that we're doing on therapies, all the information we could come up with, put together. And I started writing a book called Raising Resilient Children, Strategies for Youth Empowerment, and took all that information. And I'm like, the greatest method of human connection is education. The only way that we can break these stigmas and the only way that we can start making a difference in the world in mental health is to put everything we know on some form of communication that we can reach a broad audience. And I am not a linguist by any means, but I was like, if I put this in a book, we can share that worldwide. I have a few connections with, friends of friends that are outside of the US. And the conversation that we're having with them is very, very different than the conversation we're having in the US, mostly because of our, of our circumstances. And so I had one guy in particular reached out that as I was finishing the book up, he reached out. He said, I was told that you were writing this book, or I saw that you were writing this book. I'd like to read it. I'd like to see what's in the book. And he's only a couple chapters in, as far as I know. And he's like, this needs to be a worldwide conversation, because this is not what we're having in our local area. And it's all valid. It's all good information. And, we had a mental health. I think she's a licensed social worker or something along those lines that kind of read a couple of parts of it and was like, yeah, no, this needs to be mass distributed. Like, this is from the parent's perspective. This is outside of the mental health realm. This is from somebody who's lived it. from somebody who's experienced these exact challenges. And that changes the entire conversation.
So where can people find your book?
So it's going to be released on Amazon. It's going to be paperback on Amazon, and I'm working on making it an e-read as well, so on Kindle. But I'm hoping that it will be able to hit retail stores. I'm hoping that we can get it, mass distributed. It's just gonna take a bit to get it there.
Absolutely. And how can people find and support your group, the cause, Mending Minds Village?
The best way right now to find us is to reach us through my personal website, through my speaking website. So KadenMattinson.com. Or you can give me a call. I've got the phone right here next to me at all times. So you can reach me by phone at 801-259-3312.
And the last thing I wanted to do, start doing for this podcast, is ask you, who is in your village? Anybody you want to do a shout out to? Anybody close to you? Anybody that's been a big influence?
So I'd like to do two of them. So one is my wife, who she's been very much the co-founder of the organization and has been right there through it all with us. So, I do a lot of the face work and she does a lot of behind the scenes. So some of the stuff I'm doing, you can thank her for. But then, I like to take time to recognize somebody that I've never met before. Right. So there's always a conversation with speakers on who is your motivation? Like, who is it that you are aspiring to be? And if you've never heard of Gary Vaynerchuk, you need to do some research. Gary V is changing the conversation in a massive way. He's changing the way that we communicate. He's changing the way that humans are interacting with other humans, taking the basis off of words and really listening for the understanding. One of the greatest talks I ever saw from him is, he has his favorite 4-letter words and he's not afraid to use them. And people are so offended by that. And it's like, why are you so offended by it? It's a word. It's a word. You look it up in the dictionary. There's a definition of that word. So why are we allowing words to define us? Why are we not allowing the meaning behind the words to define us? He's such a great talker. I mean, he has sold me on many things, but yeah, that's a huge one. And then, all of our people with the organization, all of our volunteers, all of our clients who are going through it, we see you, we hear your journey. And, and if you're not one of our clients, but you have a similar story, know that there are people out here that are watching you. Know that there are people that are out here fighting in your corner, even though you don't.
Beautiful. Kaden, thank you so much for your time. This is awesome. I love the work that you're doing here.
Well, we appreciate you too, Michael. Thank you so much for having me on. And
thank you.
We look forward to talking more.
Thank you for joining us today. If you found us informative, thought-provoking, or learned something new, please leave a review or a comment and tell a friend about the podcast. Feedback means the world to me, as I want to make this the best possible podcast that it can be, and to help others identify the causes of and solutions to problems in their own lives and villages. Until next time, let's keep working on rebuilding the village.